Thank you very much. I just want to start by extending my solidarity, our solidarity, to the Palestinians suffering under the bombs. A very cruel reign of terror on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, so I hope we all extend our solidarity. I'd also like to extend the solidarity to the Palestinians in Yarmouk refugee camp in the suburbs of Damascus, who have for the last 3 years been living under siege, not by the Israelis but by the Ba'athist regime. People on the verge of starvation and on the verge of surrender. And I'll just say how I also like to add my voice to call for the release of Razan Zaitouni and her comrades, who was a very principled civil rights fighter in Syria, who became one of the key leaders of the protest movement and was kidnapped by forces unknown quite recently. It marked a real, I think, a low point for us all. I want to, as briefly as I can, and I know this is a very contentious issue, but I'll try as briefly as I can, try and outline the history of the Syrian revolution and its tragedy. And I just wanted to start by saying that the Syrian revolution, even though we date it from March 2011, its history goes back much further to a series of neoliberal reforms introduced by Bashar al-Assad after he inherited the presidency from his father. These reforms were part of a deal Syria was hatching with the European Union, known as the Euromed Agreement, which essentially was the privatization of large chunks of Syrian industry, the land, and so on. This originally, what they then called the Damascus Spring, was originally also supposed to go hand in hand with a whole series of political reforms. The political reforms stopped very, very quickly, a few months after they were announced, but the neoliberal attack on the Syrian workers, on the Syrian society, moved at a massive, massive pace and caused huge amounts of discontent. These reforms, the neoliberal reforms, are the immediate catalyst for the uprising. They forced tens of thousands, some say almost 1 million people off the land into the cities, to create belts of misery around most of the major Syrian cities, and these belts of misery became the engine of the revolution once it broke out. Now, the immediate spark for the revolution was the kidnapping and torture of about 15 school kids who had the temerity of writing "The people demand the fall of the regime" on their wall, on the wall of their school, to echo the revolutions in Tunisia and in Egypt, and then made the mistake of signing their names underneath it. They were kidnapped by the security services, they were thrown about from one security service to another, and their parents were insulted. I think the story goes around that when the parents of the school children went to the governor of Syria, of Daher province, he said to them, "Don't worry about these children, send us your wives and we'll make more for you." It was a complete and utter insult to them. And the first kind of demonstration that begins is when rumours go around that the children were being brought back to the central square in Daher to be executed in public. Actually they weren't, they were about to be released, but this caused such a massive shock inside of the city that huge demonstrations began to appear. And these demonstrations were very interesting because, unlike the demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt and so on, the demands were not for the fall of the regime. The first demands were the people demand the implementation of reforms. There were still quite large illusions in Bashar al-Assad, who was seen, to be honest with you, as a reformer. He was seen as the soft side of the regime, that he would actually begin to make good on the promises of the political reforms and so on. Instead, what happened was these demonstrations, which were largely peaceful, they were quite popular and so on, were met with quite fierce repression. The first repression happens in Daher, then you get solidarity demonstrations breaking out in other parts of the country. They face repression, other demonstrations come out and so on, and you have to get a rolling series of demonstrations, at first modest, that then get bigger and bigger and bigger, culminating, I think, probably in the one I think everyone considers to be the kind of high point of this period, which was something like 1 million people out on the streets of Hama. What was quite clear was this was a very popular movement. What was quite clear was this was also a secular movement. In terms of the slogans that you heard in the early days of the revolution, were "the Syrian people are one." I went back recently to look at footage from a place called Latakia, which is now in the heartlands of the Ba'ath, Ba'ath Party kind of supporters, in which there was a demonstration of Sunnis and Alawis, the two kind of main religious sects, in which they were saying Sunni, Alawi, one people, we're together, one hand, and so on. You see very much that this was a very important part of the beginning of the uprising. But then you got the panic inside the regime, a regime that could not deliver any reforms it promised, and only met the growing demonstrations with even more severe and vicious repression. And it reaches the point where soldiers are sent in to neighbourhoods in order to put down these demonstrations, the soldiers simply turning their guns on their officers, beginning to come back to defend the neighbourhoods, and you get the beginning of areas. Sometimes neighbourhoods eventually will become cities, simply stripping out the control of the regime itself. By the summer of 2012, the regime pretty much collapses across most of Syria, and in its place we have the beginnings of some form of popular rule, sometimes known as district committees, local committees, coordinating committees, and so on, in which ordinary people took control of their village, sometimes of their neighbourhoods, sometimes of whole towns and cities, and attempted to put in practice some kind of democratic control. But they faced an immediate problem, which was that most of the military bases in Syria are located around the major cities. It wasn't like they didn't think this was going to happen. So these towns, when they stepped out of the control of the regime, the artillery barrages start, and so on. And this then creates a new level of discontent, and what they call the demonstrations in solidarity with the cities under siege. At this point, the regime then sweeps through mainly Damascus, but other areas as well, doing mass arrests. And I think something like 100,000, who knows, to be honest with you, how many people. So anyone in a neighbourhood, any young man in the neighbourhood, young woman in the neighbourhood was being picked up. These mass sweeps then trigger some kind of armed response from the neighbourhoods, usually from the defector troops, the mutinous troops, and so on. And this then begins the process triggers eventually an armed uprising. I remember feeling, I think, the most optimistic I've ever felt in the summer of 2012, because these demonstrations of what was happening in Syria exceeded all my wildest imaginings, my wildest desires. It was really, you really felt that things had changed so dramatically that we could never go back to where we were before. And I freely admit, and I think quite a few others freely admit, that we thought the regime's days were numbered. We thought it wouldn't be long before Bashar al-Assad falls and another one of the dictators is fallen. We could see another progression of the Arab revolutions. Instead, there was a sudden and dramatic shift. And this was triggered by a speech by the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in which he essentially called on everyone to defend the regime against what he described as a plot by the USA, the Israelis, and so on. And we've heard all this kind of stuff before. The USA, the Israelis, and the Islamic fundamentalists, Sunni Islamic fundamentalists. So he injects immediately this sense of sectarianism, starts to enter into the language of the regime. There was then, if you remember, the massacre of Hulla, which was the first kind of serious massacre in which Sunnis, mainly Sunnis, were murdered huge numbers were murdered by Alawi militia. This was, if you like, the trigger for then the deepening sectarianism of the war. At this point, I should talk a little bit about the politics of the movement, because the thing is that when we compare, for example, Syria with Egypt or with Tunisia, when we look at Tunisia, you see the development of a trade union movement that was quite strong, that played quite a key role in the overthrow of Ben Ali. Then you look at Egypt, you talk about Mahal al-Kubra and all the mass strikes and so on, that the kind of working class power, if you like, working class base that would eventually express itself in the overthrow of the dictators was absent in Syria. So was the state of the regime. It was so harsh. I mean, we had an expression for it when I worked as a journalist in Lebanon, is that can we peer under the blanket? So any news coming from Syria was so unusual that even though you lived quite close and you had loads of contacts, very rarely did anything come out. You felt the repression constantly, and the kind of darkness that there was in Syria at the time. So the political development of the movement in Syria started from much further back. We started to see general strikes developing inside the Syrian movement, but it happened much, much later. We began to see mass demonstrations in Aleppo, the most important industrial city inside of Syria, but after the armed rebellion begins at home. So you begin to see the way in which, if you like, the underdevelopment of the workers' movement. It hadn't really developed in the workers' movement in the way it had before, meant that the events were overtaking the development of the stuff on the ground quite early. 5 minutes left. Okay, thank you. So it is at this point, with in the summer of 2012, where large sections of the parts of the country are now under some form of popular control. They have the counter-offensive by the regime, spearheaded by Hezbollah, but also the only troops they could rely on, but also they began to import the sectarian militias from Iraq, the ones that had been massacring Sunnis 2 or 3 or 4 years earlier. And these became the battering ram in which they began to push back the rebels, who were very lightly armed. And when this begins to happen, you then begin to see the rise, the rise of the Islamist organizations. The Islamist organizations begin to rise because they have funding, they have some way of getting some kind of weapons, mainly from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and their supporters inside the Gulf. At which point, the lightly armed rebels who originally emerged, what we call the Free Brigades, then begin to drift over to the Islamists. You begin to see the rise of the Islamists. At that time, the rise of the Islamists was quite worrying, but many people saw them as being quite effective in their struggle against the regime. They were quite brave fighters, especially ones coming from Iraq, who'd been trained, as they say, trained by the Americans. That is, fought the Americans and therefore had some kind of advanced knowledge of guerrilla warfare. They began to dominate inside of the resistance, but coexist with the local coordinating committees, with the local councils and so on. And as the war becomes deeper, more bitter, you then have the mass fleeing of the population, in which then the basis of which the local committees, the revolutionary committees existed, then began to disappear from underneath them. So they became quite isolated, and then very quickly after that, we have the emergence of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was Al-Qaeda's franchise inside of Syria, and then that's the split from that, the radical split from Al-Qaeda, that we all know now as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. When ISIS appears, they go through, wherever they appear, they simply slaughter the revolutionaries. So and I remember people might know, we ran a very good and excellent article on a place called Manbij. So inside story about in Socialist Review late last year, a beautifully described story of how the Revolutionary Committee developed, how the problems they faced and so on. 2 weeks after we went to press, most of those people had been killed. They had been killed, if you like, what we call now the counter-revolution, coming from inside the revolution itself. And you began to see at that point the squeezing of the original revolutionary forces, on the one hand fighting a well-armed regime, militias from Lebanon and Iraq, on the other hand behind them, ISIS beginning to appear and undercutting them. And I think when they talk about the numbers of killed of the northern rebels around Aleppo, they lost 10 times more fighting against ISIS at the hands of ISIS than they did at the hands of the regime. And you began to see the way in which the regime and ISIS began, I don't believe they coordinate in any kind of way, I don't have that kind of conspiracy theory, but you began to see the way in which suddenly these revolutionary forces were caught and trapped completely between the hammer and the anvil, and they began to face deeper and deeper problems. And I think it was the surrender of Homs quite recently, the heart of the revolution, the very soul of the revolution, the place where the uprising really begins in a serious way, its final surrender was, I think, a terrible blow to events I think that's happening now around Aleppo, where the mainly peasant army, originally peasants came into the city and managed to drive the regime out. Now ISIS has essentially abandoned all its positions and allowed the regime now to come in. So we're talking now about really we're facing the collapse of Aleppo as well. And I think it's important we understand the forces that were at play here. The revolution begins, it's a real revolt. It comes from below. When you watch the videos and you understand the local dialect, all the accents you hear are the accents working class peasantry. These are the accents you hear. So there's no question of what the social character of this movement was. You saw the neighbourhoods where they were. These were the poor belts of misery. These were the working class neighbourhoods of the cities and so forth. And when you see and then when you had, if you like, I think the term I use is revolution with too many enemies. That in the end there was too many forces acting against the interests of the revolution that were really important. I'm just going to finish, I have 35 seconds, I'm going to finish on one last point, which is the connection, which is Joseph will take up hopefully in more detail, which was for me, I think the point at which the whole lie about the revolution being the toy or the plaything or the proxy of Western forces, was when Bashar al-Assad panics in the face of an offensive coming from the Ghouta area of Damascus. There's a big offensive coming. He launches chemical weapons on this area. Several thousand people are killed, and sorry, my phone is telling me my time's up. So several thousand people are killed, and the threat then, it looks like a real possibility there's going to be US airstrikes. This is the point at which ISIS then sweeps through the north. So at the point at which there seems to be direct intervention from the west inside the events in Syria, this marks the point, the lowest point for the real revolutionary forces, because they were then turned on by ISIS and so on. And so the revolution itself had too many enemies. The revolution itself, even though it was real, faced overwhelming odds. And now when we look, and I feel for the Syrians, being Lebanese, you know, had this joke, we'll say, you know, how long have you been here? And I will say a month, because you know, originally we came in 1975 to spend a month, and you know, 35 years later, I'm still very, very long month. And I feel for the Syrians in this terms that they face some kind of future similar to Lebanon. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Joseph Day.
First of all, I would like to thank Marxism for inviting me to speak today about the Syrian revolution process, which is, I think, very important and has been put aside, or not, of course, by your organization, but among the left and in the discussion among the left, the Syrian revolution process has been put aside, unfortunately. And when Simon was speaking about Palestinian solidarity, of course, I joined this, and I would just like to remind that yesterday, when Aleppo is bombed every day, he was sitting with, in solidarity with Gaza in Aleppo under occupation by the regime. And in 2012, October, when Gaza was again under the bombs of the Israeli, it wasn't the regime that were doing demonstration, it was the people of Syria in struggle and the as a friend of mine was saying yesterday, Yarmouk and Gaza, we are one. And this is very important to remind everyone. The Syrian revolutionary process has been understood, explained by most of the medias and also sections of the left as a sectarian conflict, as a geopolitical conflict, and the roots, as explained by Simon, were never, in the far majority of the left, not put forward. The Syrian revolutionary process, and it's important to reiterate, it's part of the revolutionary processes that started in Tunis, Egypt, Bahrain, and throughout the region. It is part of a revolutionary process that demands democracy, social justice, and it's against sectarianism. This is the root of the Syrian revolutionary process, and I won't go back because Simon did it. And among this, a section of the left did indeed betray the Syrian revolutionary process, and the arguments that are today being used that the revolution has been hijacked has been the same for 3 years. Saying that this revolution has been hijacked since the first day. So it was a conspiracy that has been ongoing for the past 5 years, and that reactionary forces were the one leading the movement since the beginning. I just want you to hear this interview of Amr al-Shishani, who was head of the Daesh, ISIS Islamic State. When he arrived in Syria, he's from Chechnya. Was part first of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and after the break, radical split on the right. We have the right of Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq now. He said, this was summer 2012. When he first arrived, he was very surprised to see people smoking, sharing their beards, instead of letting it grow. They listened to songs, and flags of the revolution did not contain the formula of the oneness of God. I wonder where I felt. All of these have seemed to be very discouraging. Just to remind you that all the people that said that this movement was a reactionary movement at the beginning, the people on the ground, the reactionary people said, why did I fail? This is a democratic popular movement. So this is just to remind the people that live in the West, intellectuals of the left as well, that were speaking about Syria, didn't know a single thing what was happening, and were closed into a dichotomia of geopolitical and sectarian analysis. And this is something to remind, I think. Now, I can't hide you that the situation in Syria is very, very complicated, and we will reach the level of the popular movement being at least lowest level. The dangers, the threats on the Syrian revolution are real and present and growing. But Syria is not alone on this. We have to understand the revolution process in Syria in a global perspective and a regional perspective. It's the same in Egypt. In some aspects, it's the same as well in Tunis, when you have the growth of Nida Tunis, which is the remnants of the Ben Ali's regime, the dichotomia between two forms of counter-revolution. The old regimes that are more dangerous, and we have to acknowledge it, in Egypt, in Tunis, and in Syria, which is not the old because it's still the current one, and other forms, which is Islamic reactionary forces. So let me please first frame my words and use a very, to define my words. I know that when we speak, especially from the West, when I use Islamic reactionary forces, I don't mean Muslims. Because the Syrian revolution process also has been used by Islamophobic people from the right and the left to go against the Syrian revolution process. Islamic reactionary forces is a particular ideology that Muslims can join, but the far majority until today have not joined it. Muslims can be left, can be liberals, Democrats. Yes. So just want to be clear in my definition. For me, it's very important. The popular movement, nevertheless, despite these threats that are represented by the regime and its allied, and I will come back to the forms of different imperialism and some imperialism, is facing the counter-revolutionary threat of the Assad regime and its ally Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, which is destructive on a daily basis. Just to show you an example, since the beginning of the year in Aleppo, the barrels bomb dropped by the Assad regime did 2,000 dead in Aleppo. The last, because they didn't have any more barrel bombs, they used micro buses to drop them full of TNT on the neighborhoods by the Syrian opposition. This counter-revolution is still present and is fighting against the revolution. But there's another counter-revolutionary threat, and we cannot hide it. And section of the Syrian opposition, the bourgeois liberal opposition, have hide it, and not only hide it, sided with it. And I'm speaking about the Islamic Front, led by Zahan al-Louj, supported by Gulf countries, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the official Al-Qaeda, and Daesh, ISIS. After there are differences between both of them, between these different groups, but these groups, in their totality, refuse the objectives of the Syrian revolution, which are democracy, social justice, and sectarianism. And we have to be very clear on this. And we've been, for the revolutionary current, since the beginning, very clear on these basics. Now I'll speak a bit of the popular movement to show you that even though with all these threats, it still continues, and it still actually fights against both these two counter-revolutionary threats depending on the region. And I'll start with 2013 with the example of Raqqa. Raqqa was the only capital of a province that was liberated. It's in northeast of Syria that is today occupied by ISIS. In this city, in March 2013, this city was completely liberated, and for 6 months before ISIS occupied it, was completely self-governed. Because as Simon explained, it's true that Syria didn't have a strong independent working movement. But in the same time, in Syria, we've seen the highest level of self-organization in the revolutionary processes of the region because the state disappeared. And this is not anything, especially if we believe that the emancipation of the working class is the work of the working class. And these people were working people. These people were taking care of every single thing of their city. For 6 months, Raqqa was completely self-organized by the people in terms of welcoming the refugees, in terms of doing the baccalaureate, the exams of the students, about treating psychological case, and women played a humongous role in it. Women were at the lead because there was a fight at this time between popular organization that, to tell you, they registered in the first 3 months, there was a registration for popular organization to be active, etc. In 3 months, we had 45 popular organizations led by youth that were registered in 3 months in Raqqa. Just to give you another example of the dynamics of the popular movement in Syria, this is on a general basis. Before the revolution, you had 3 independent private newspapers owned by businessmen close to the regime. After 2 years, you had 60 newspapers run, at minimum 60 newspapers run by local councils, by youth organizations, etc. in Syria. For 6 months, this city was completely run by the popular councils, the people of Raqqa. And they were in a constant battle with Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, who imprisoned Democrat activists. And it was very often women who led demonstrations to ask for the freedom of political prisoners. And one woman is very well known in Raqqa, Sauda Nawfal, was known as the woman who wear pants in Raqqa. And she was always the one daily demonstrating against them. And when ISIS occupied the city and occupied the church of the city, transforming it into a security center, who demonstrated? The people of Raqqa singing, the Syrian people are one, and we refuse the division between Christians and Muslims. And this has been a permanent feature of the Syrian revolution until today. They refuse sectarianism and they say it again and again. The last 6 months, who led the struggle against ISIS? It's not the regime. The regime, for example, did not bomb Raqqa since it was occupied by ISIS. In the beginning of 2014, you had the popular explosions, popular demonstrations led in different cities of North Syria against ISIS that pushed the Islamic factions to battle ISIS. And ISIS was kicked out of a few neighborhoods. For the 3rd year of the anniversary of the revolution, you had popular demonstrations in different areas of Syria where it was possible. You had popular exhibition made. For example, in Aleppo, you had an art exhibition that was made, picture exhibition. You had in Italy, you had also exhibition, theater play, to talk about the revolution, how it was, to say what was the objectives of the revolution and still are. For the elections, the so-called election of Bashar al-Assad, that it was fantastic, and it's the only time you will see an election with 3 candidates and 2 saying that he's better. Bashar al-Assad. We'll never see another election saying basically we won, but the best candidate is definitely Bashar al-Assad. Sure, democratic and open in Syria. Fair play as well, fair play very much. There were people in regime-occupied region distributing leaflets reminding what the revolution is. What are the objectives of the revolution? Youth people, they did it in Damascus, Aleppo, and Hama. And as well, people organized all over Syria. You had people putting baskets and putting the picture of Bashar al-Assad, throw your vote on this. Another story, I can speak a lot about this. But also you had demonstrations against Islamic reactionary groups. You had Minbij, that Simon talked about, did a general strike against ISIS. You had people in Ghouta for the liberation of Hazan Zaytoune, unknown groups, but we know it's the Zahran al-Lush Islamic army that most probably kidnapped them. There were demonstrations against them. Also in Aleppo saying, traitors are the people that kidnapped the revolutionaries. It was a saying that was used at the beginning of the revolution, traitors are who killed our people, for Bashar al-Assad. So on both sides, they're struggling. And this is to give you a couple of examples that the popular movement is still alive. Imperialism and sub-imperialism. Since when should we choose between the evil or the lesser worse evil? Since when do we choose that Raqqa is kind of better? Since when? Our tradition is no Washington, no Moscow. And I can develop a lot on this, but I don't think it needs a lot. And what we can see is that although there are competitions among imperialists, and among bourgeois class you have competition. But in the case of Syria and the revolutionary processes, there's one thing that is very clear. They all agree that these revolutionary processes must stop. Russia, the USA agree on this. And you see them cooperating in Iraq. You can see for the past 3 years, The same solution has been addressed to the Syrian revolution. We need a Yemeni solution. So bring a little bit of the bourgeois liberal opposition of Syria that is close to Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the West with the Assad regime. But Obama consistently said, we need this regime to stay. Israel said the same. We refuse any kind of imperialism, and sub-imperialism as well. Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I can expand if you want later. And for the people that think Putin is a great anti-imperialist, 2 days ago he said he supports the struggle of Israel. So I'm sorry for the people who believe that Putin could save Palestine. Where to go from now? I will conclude on this. Of course, as it's been repeated by comrades from the region and by comrades here, it's the need, and we're doing this since the beginning, despite our modest capacities to build a revolutionary party in Syria. The revolutionary left current in Syria is dedicated to build a revolutionary party inside of Syria, and also to build a third current that is opposing all the different threats of the counter-revolutionary, the counter-revolutions, the regime, and the Islamic reactionary forces. Because we believe in the objectives of the Syrian revolutionary process, which is democracy, social justice, and also to sectarianism. And in this, we have four main objectives: building and reorganizing an independent working class in Syria, in a destroyed country, which will be very difficult, and is a thing that we have to think about. But not only, because there are key issues for a revolutionary party to do, because we are not only on an economic basis, we are the tribune of the oppressed, we are the tribune of all the people in struggle. And this means we have to treat the issue of sectarianism. We have to battle sectarianism, as it was explained in another, I won't come back now, it's a modern phenomenon. We have to be at the lead of democratic rights, women issues, and the Kurdish issues. And for this, I would like just to point out, it is not right to point out that the leadership of the Kurdish people might be, and it is, for example, in Iraq, Kurdistan, working with the imperialists. But, sorry, did you see the PA with who it's working? Should we say that therefore the Palestinian people don't have the right for self-determination? Since when do we have this kind of, we support the self-determination of the people, we don't support maybe this particular leadership. But first of all, especially in a context in the Middle East and North Africa where the left, nationalists, the Arab nationalist left, collaborated in the discrimination of the Kurdish people and their repression, we have to be very clear on this. Finally, and this is one of my final words, I would like just to cite a citation, and I'm done, promise. As I tried to explain you, I believe that the Syrian revolution is still alive, and this is why I would like to say that.
I'll let you do your one. It's okay.
Vladimir Lenin said, the Marxist is therefore the first to take the path of direct revolutionary struggle. The Marxist is the last to leave the path of direct revolutionary struggle. He leaves it only when all possibilities have been exhausted, when there is no shadow of hope for a shorter way, when the basis for an appeal prepare mass strikes, an uprising, etc., it's obviously disappearing. Therefore, a Marxist treats with contempt the innumerable renegade of the revolution who shout to him, "We are more progressive than you. We were the first to renounce to the revolution. We were the first to submit to the monarchist constitution." And therefore, a lot of people have abandoned the revolution, but we don't. And as someone that, of course, you know, Tony Cleave said, a revolutionary cannot accept the defeat of the revolution until objectives leave no room for doubt. The revolutionaries are the last to leave the battlefield. We will be the last to leave the battlefield, and we will continue.
There are a lot of talk. My question is essentially, I'm from Wales, but I've been living in Turkey, and we've been hearing a lot in Turkey about the crossings, the control of the border crossings, and letting the al-Nusra and other jihadist groups come through in order to obviously counter the Kurdish groups. So what is going on up there so much from your perspective? And also, how do you feel about the Kurdish struggle as it stands. That's it.
I am Selma from NPA in France. So the Syrian revolutionary process really raised up new questions on defining the nature of imperialism, and it was for us very useful to support the Syrian revolution to understand that there are two ways of understanding anti-imperialist fight. You have a kind of view which is what I would call imperialism from above, which is a way which could be useful sometimes to prevent from our countries to attack countries under imperialism. But at the same time, it tends to forget the fact that there is an agency of the population, especially when they are struggling, and the new thing that has to be fought for in anti-imperialist, I would say, united front, is that the Arab Revolution included the need to support the people who are actually struggling against their regimes. So you have these two antagonistic views fighting over, especially over the Syrian issue, which is anti-imperialism from above, which is also a way to fantasize over Arab countries and bring some kind of orientalistic view on Arab countries without understanding the contradictions within the classes. And at the same time, a kind of imperialism from below. So the reality in France is that the anti-imperialist struggles are very low, especially when France is doing attacks on Africa, which is quite huge, and also intervening in the Arab world. But few members, including the NPA, but not only the NPA, manage to, denounce also the fact that France was collaborating with this regime. Just to say shortly, so we came to a point last year when the question of the bombings were raised, not only to say don't attack Syria, but support actively and concretely the Syrian revolutionaries, which means that one of our main speakers, Olivier Besancenot, was saying on TV, okay, we support we are against the attacks, but we ask and we demand that the weapons could be given to the revolutionaries themselves to free themselves. And the question of power also that is taken by these people, not only something that comes from above. And so this really means also some kind of break and violent debates around those who were saying just don't attack. So my question is also from Britain, how also this kind of fight against imperialism from above and from below reshapes also the fight against anti-imperialism today and the support for the revolution. Thank you.
My question is how far would you might regard Syria or some other country of that nature as a kind of bit part player in something which is somewhat bigger? I mean, you mentioned sectarianism and things of that nature. To me, the source of a large amount of the problem exists not necessarily in Syria, but in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies. If the revolution were to succeed, then the counter-revolutionary nature of countries like Saudi Arabia would cause there to be a very great deal of pressure against that revolution if it were successful. And my question is, wouldn't it be better to try and create some situation where the revolution happens first in the Gulf tyrannies, and then it's no longer possible for those Gulf tyrannies to aid and support counter-revolutionary groups like Al-Nusra and ISIS and so forth and so on?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, on what the last speaker said, I think it'd be great if there were revolutions in the Gulf. I think it'd help if we got a couple of revolutions going in the West as well. In terms of what I wanted to say quickly, and it is, I think the question of the hypocrisy that the revolution has highlighted across the board politically is a quite important one, is I think one that socialists or activists in the West need to exploit a bit. So of course there's the hypocrisy of the so-called anti-imperialist camp, whether it be Russia, the things you talked about, or, you know, for all of Hezbollah's great talk of anti-imperialism, they were very good at ethnically cleansing Qusayr. They were less good, still are less good, at giving practical solidarity with the people of Gaza in struggle now. Despite all the slogans, people of Gaza are still left to struggle on their own. So of course there is that hypocrisy, but I think there is an importance for us in highlighting the hypocrisy of the governments in the West. For all the talk of the support to the revolution, the reality has been one of leaving the revolution to be massacred, because in the end the biggest anti-imperialist threat is that of the people organizing themselves. And so a lot of finger pointing has been made of, look, all the interference of the West. I think what we actually have to highlight is that there's been almost no interference whatsoever. I'd be interested in knowing what the speakers think. I wouldn't be surprised if in not too long we start seeing a common front developing between the United States and the Syrians over the question of ISIS. Suddenly the regime has started attacking a few ISIS positions for the first time in quite a while. The Americans need alliances. Their position has always been leave the regime intact but move Assad. It's not that far-fetched, it seemed to me, to exchange moving that position a little bit to leave the regime and Assad can stay as well, to have an alliance on trying to stabilize the region. Thank you. And I wonder what people think about that. And then quickly on the practical solidarity, I think there's quite a lot of things we can do. I think the question of weapons is a complicated one, because of course it's something we should raise maybe in a propagandistic way, but we know where the weapons will go. The weapons won't go to the local coordination committees, they won't go to Joseph and his comrades. You know, the basis now is training is available if you only fight ISIS and not the regime. So the question of weapons I think is complicated, but the question of refugees I think is an important one. For all the talk of the British government of solidarity, they've so far taken 24 Syrian refugees in. They've agreed 300 and they've taken in 24. So the Syrian Solidarity Movement in Britain has started organising demonstrations, calling on the British government to open the borders. And not only is that important of direct solidarity, but it also raises an important argument in Britain over the attack on immigration, the whipping up of racism against immigration. It's two things we can bring together and highlight the hypocrisy of our own ruling class on that question.
Hi, my question is that, the Kurdish soldiers basically they're fighting. So what is like? It's like America and Israel, like America and Iran. Basically, they're just getting together like as a team, and they're just trying to get into Israel to kill people. So one of my identity is to get like young people from like, if they're Kurdish, they just want them to be their show their identity. So when they go to school, so they can say I'm Kurdish, they can be what they can't do that. So they have no that rights to do it. So that's my question.
Thank you.
Come first, then you.
I'm active in Germany, and there are currently two issues which are tearing apart the German left and the German anti-war movements. One is Ukraine, one is Syria. And it seems that these are two different issues, but if you see, it's the same people lining up on each side on the issue, and it's essentially the same argument just being used in a different way. On the one hand, there's the argument that you've got to, at the very least, you can't criticise Assad because the alternative is worse. And a similar position being put forward around Putin in Ukraine. There's recently a case as a MP from the German Left Party who's recently been appearing on anti-war demos organised by right-wing anti-Semites. He's written a long justification of his presence by these, and one of his justifications was He stands in opposition to groups like the March 21 network, who is supporting the fascists in Syria and in Maidan. And this idea that Putin and Assad are the bulwark against fascism and against American imperialism, I think it's the legacy of Stalinism, it's the influence of the old German Communist Party, but it's a new sort of Stalinism. It's not a Stalinism which says these regimes in Syria and Russia are anything that we particularly like, but as long as they're not as bad as the alternative, then there's something which we've got to critically support. And this comes to the question raised by the French comrade: how important is it talking about working class alternatives, talking about alternative from below? If you don't talk about a working class alternative and an alternative below, then you end up automatically in this lesser evilism. You end up making apologies for Assad, you end up making apologies for Putin, because you don't have any other perspective. Because everybody knows we've got to oppose the fascists, everybody knows we've got to oppose American imperialism. Unless you see real forces which are capable of doing this, then you end up lining yourself up with all sorts of dangerous forces, and you actually end up demobilising the anti-war movement in your own country.
Followed by the woman in the black dress.
Frank Stone from Norwich SWP, and also convener of Norwich Stop the War. I just wanted to reply to a speaker in the political debate, where he picked up a leaflet, he said, of a Stop the War leaflet about Syria, which was supporting the Assad regime and also mentioning Hezbollah and so on. I can't, of course, refute what he said, that leaflet that he picked up said, but I would say that that is certainly not the position of Stop the War nationally in relation to the Assad regime and in relation to the situation in Syria. And it certainly isn't the position, it's not the type of leaflet that we in Norwich, in Norfolk, would have put out about the Syrian situation. We do, of course, take great credit or great satisfaction from the fact that we stopped Western intervention in terms of our government intervening in Syria, which then perpetuated itself with the Americans themselves changing their position on military intervention. So I think we may not have stopped the war in Iraq, we may not have stopped the war in Afghanistan, but we did stop an intervention, and we should take credit for that, because it's the first time in decades that the Parliament has not endorsed the executive in sending troops abroad to interfere in the Middle East. So that, I think, is something we should as a movement take some credit for. We know, though, that there's still a desperate situation there. I would like to ask the speakers what practical steps we can take, not we the British nation, but we the ordinary people of the land, can take to help the revolution now in the Middle East and in Syria.
Followed by the woman in the black dress next.
I think there's one thing I would like to talk about is what is the revolutionary potential? Because we've been hearing about the counter-revolution, all of these things which are very true and very real on every single day, but there is something else happening, and this is what I want to highlight about. 1,400,000 Syrian refugees came into Lebanon. The lesser numbers went to Jordan, others in Turkey. What you have right now is the borders that were imposed by colonialism in the early centuries and then enforced by the Arab rulers and the regional rulers are deteriorating by the daily experiences of people connecting to each other. You have Egyptian activists and Lebanese activists flying together from Beirut to Cairo all the time. You have new theater plays, new political songs, new culture of resistance and revolution happening. And then you have Palestine as a constant reminder that what actually made Israel strong and able to maintain its terror over the Palestinian people, it's actually that Palestine was under siege by the Arab regimes from the beginning. You have
the kicking out of the Palestinian resistance out of Lebanon, the siege over the camps, then you have the destruction of the defeat of the Palestinian liberation movement by the Syrian regime. You have the blockade, you have the racist policies and the peace deal done by the Egyptian regime with the Israeli state and Jordan and all of it. This is the actual siege that happens, and that this actually created the most favorable environment for the Israeli state and for imperialism to continue the oppression of the Palestinian people. So in this spectrum, what we have right now is states in crisis. You have Arab regimes are completely in crisis, whether the Assad, whether in Lebanon, whether in Egypt, and everywhere. And what we have, although there's the assumption of the counter-revolution, but at the same time, the conditions, the contradictions that existed that actually gave the incentive for the revolutions are far from over. But as ideas, as well as the revolution experience move with people, as it happened before when the Palestinian refugees moved into Lebanon, they galvanized the crisis, they galvanized the contradictions that existed in Lebanon, and also gave fuel to the revolutionary movement in Lebanon in the 1960s and 70s, as well as across the region. It actually defied the borders that were created by colonialism and enforced by the regime. I think that's the potential that we have right now. What we have right now is the immense common experience that Arab people are all together living together, experiencing the same, very similar contradictions, a very similar crisis within their states, and this is the potential for the next wave of revolution, and this is what we should focus on, and that's why we need an organization to be able to be prepared and to think outside of the national borders enforced by colonialism and the Arab rules, and to think of a more mass Arab revolt against these regimes, against imperialism, and against the counter-revolution. Thank you.
Hi there, I've just got two quick contributions to make. First of all, I've got a tailor from Kurdistan, and as you can see, he's done a fantastic job. But I actually got into a conversation with him, and just the points I wanted to make really were the following. We just started a conversation, and everything that I was able to talk to him about Kurdistan, I learned because I'm in the Socialist Workers Party, because I always find the Arab question very difficult because of the nature of it, and that's why the meetings today really make it so much clearer. But everything that I was able to say is because I'm a member and I have read Socialist Review and I've read newspapers, and then I read the ISJ and struggle to get my head around some of the more complicated matters. But what was really interesting was that he was very clear. He said to me, and it was the definition of what he gave himself. He said, I mean, forgive my maths, but he said something like, I'm Kurdish, I'm part Iranian, and I'm part from Iraq. And I've never really thought of that before, that, you know, actually that's the kind of makeup that there can be. And he also then took out some colours. He said, see these colours, they were yellow and red, and some other colour, which is Kurdish flag. And he said, sorry, green. In Turkey, he said, the Turkish police would stop me all the time as a Kurd and ask me my identity, and so it's very, very clear. So, and he was very clear, because I said, so what's the situation? And he said, well, we're in the mountains. He said, they're all going to be in the mountains, and they're all waiting. That seemed to be his attitude. So I think that's very interesting. And the other point, really, which is a completely different point, is that in terms of what's happening in the British state about people that go to Syria, is our support unconditional? Because it's interesting who do they go and fight for. I think that's quite an interesting question, really. That's only just occurred to me now. Oops, sorry.
1 minute.
And the other question about Syria, really, and about ISIS is we had a branch meeting about ISIS, and it's still very unclear. So what I'm getting from this meeting is that ISIS definitely actually try and, it seems to me from what you're saying, crush the revolutionary forces rather than be revolutionary themselves. And I just wanted to be, I'm sorry if that's unclear, but it's a very complicated debate. So thank you very much.
We have a lot of interesting questions and interventions, so thank you very much, Mr. Boyd. About the issue of the border crossing Turkey, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Kurds, definitely the Turkish state had for a long period of time, opened completely nearly the border to different Islamist reactionary groups to prevent any kind of autonomy of the Kurdish people. But lately, they've seen that it might go back into their own, against their own interests. So therefore, there's now a new policy of not letting go through, as before, these different Islamist reactionary forces. And now, actually, if you see Turkey's position towards an independent Iraqi Kurdistan, it's mostly in favor. You shouldn't forget that the biggest investor in Iraqi Kurdistan are the Turks. And therefore, there's a peace process ongoing between the PKK and the Turkish state that is very, very fragile. So it's a complicated dynamic, but definitely we also won't forget that Turkey favored, since the beginning, the different Islamist reactionary forces inside of Turkey among the Syrian refugees, choosing, for example, different delegates from the different, in the beginning of the revolution, refusing, for example, democratic delegates elected by the own people of the refugee camps in favor of different Islamic reactionary trends. So definitely Turkey is in the region a sub-imperialist force that is supporting reactionary forces across the region. I wanted to go back, I didn't have the time, unfortunately, on the different imperialism and sub-imperialism, but it brought me also the question of Russia and the way, the short-sighting about any political analysis that is based on the foreign policy of a country, which is, we never as Marxists analyze a bourgeois regime in looking at its foreign policy. I would like to cite, I like citations, I'm sorry, Pierre Franck, Trotskyist, French Trotskyist. Let us note that the greatest theoretician of Marxism did not at all define the politics, the political nature of a bourgeois regime by the position which the latter held in the field of foreign policy, but solely and simply by the position it occupied in relation to the classes composing the nation. And this goes for the same with the Syrian regime. And even, it's not true that it was anti-imperialist and everything, but even though it was anti-imperialist, we should judge and analyze the nature of the Syrian regime according to the way he treats its popular classes. And definitely, it was neoliberal policies, it was favoring a crony capitalist regime, and favoring also different religious institutions. So, definitely when we speak about Russia, if you believe that Russia is some called progressive, go live in Russia and see how the comrades are doing. So definitely, same goes for Iran. Go check if you think it's a progressive country, the same. And when it comes to the Gulf countries has played also, as you know, it's the center of counter-revolution, and of course I wish there was a revolution in the Gulf countries, but you don't decide where a revolution starts. I mean, it's not PlayStation, you decide, it's like... It was like people saying a conspiracy theory, I wouldn't name it yesterday, saying since 2005, a conspiracy military thing was prepared for Syria. I told them that you think it's PlayStation, you're going to command the people in 2011, they're going to come out and it's fine. It's really unanalytical, and it's really strange that people that claim to be Marxist and leftists still have this kind of explanations. And maybe I'm still young, this is why. So therefore the Gulf countries supported, they don't want to see a democratic Syria, definitely. This is why they supported the most reactionary groups inside of Syria. And we shouldn't forget, because if someone's belief that Saudi Arabia, Qatar wants democracy, just see what happened in Bahrain. They fueled sectarianism. They fueled sectarianism all over the region. They don't want any kind of a democratic and progressive project in this region. And Saudi Arabia, for your information, was the biggest investor in Syria before the revolution. Qatar was one of the closest allies of the Syrian regime as well. So we shouldn't forget, as well as Turkey, by the way, Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad were best mates. Huh? So we shouldn't, we should, of course, refuse any kind of imperialism and some imperialism. Always refuse the kind of lesser evil, because this is the path to defeat. We always stand with people in struggle, always. This is our thing. Question of solidarity, I think it's very important. Actually living in Switzerland, I think the issue of refugees is key. Really pushing forward, especially in a climate in Europe of Islamophobia, increasing racism, placing the issue of refugees is, and as usual, as an internationalist, the best way to help the Syrian revolution is to fight against your own bourgeoisie. I think this is important as well to repeat it. And when we speak about the alternative to Assad is worse, the alternative to Assad is worse than Assad. It doesn't understanding that this alternative was brought by Assad. It's not understanding that these two counter-revolutionary forces are nurtured by each other. That sectarianism that we talk as a modern phenomenon, we cannot understand it in Syria without understanding the nature of this regime and the way it divided the people through sectarian policies and also racist policies against the Kurds. We don't understand the way Assad played with religious institutions for more than 30 years, as well as it played with jihadist groups going to Iraq in 2003, opened its borders, just like we were talking about Turkey, but Syrian regime did the same. There was direct collaboration between different jihadist groups and the Syrian security services. And it was closed in 2008, 2007, when there was a rapprochement between the Assad regime and the United States. And just to remind you, Clinton was saying at the beginning, Hillary Clinton was saying at the beginning of the revolution, Bashar Assad is a reformist. So again, for all the contemporaries know. So therefore, we fight against both nature of the counter-revolution because they nurture each other. Fighting with thinking that fighting against sectarianism is ignoring the Assad regime will bring only more sectarianism. And the opposite as well is true. Therefore, as the Kaframbet people said, enemies are many, but the revolution is one and continues. Thank you very much.
I just want to also address the Kurdish question. You see, early on, when the revolution began, what was clear coming out of quite a few leaders of the revolution, or people who declared themselves leaders of the revolution, was that we maintain the integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. So when the revolution begins, and you are in a Kurdish area, you're thinking, what's the difference? What's the difference between the ones who are going to come and the ones who've just gone? Because really, what's vital for us, as an oppressed nation inside of Syria, and they were oppressed, was how we get our autonomy, how we find our independence. What actually should be happening, and this is the position I think revolutionists take, is we believe absolutely granting the right of the independence of the Kurds in Syria and across the region, has been quite vital. I'll tell you how it played. It played because the large sections of the Kurds then became unsure, and at points were making deals with the regime, and at other points fighting against the regime. Actually, we could have won them over. Join our revolution, there's your independence. Actually, you have your independence, but hopefully we will create a society good enough for you to stay. But it's up to us, as the majority of Arabs who have treated you so badly over the years, to give you this. As I'm often told, the secret to a successful marriage is a right of divorce. And I think that's really important that we understand that. That's quite an important political position that we have to take. I just want to also say that I'd like to add my vote for a revolution immediately in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. And, you know, if I said this 5 years ago, I'd be like carried off. But really, you can see what's taking place in Kuwait at the moment, where there's been demonstrations after demonstrations. You see what's taking place in the United Arab Emirates, where there's strike after strike. And begin to see actually the panic that is taking place inside of Saudi Arabia. When a democracy activist gets 15 years in jail, that means they're frightened of something. They're frightened of something because actually this revolutionary process is continuing. It's simmering away. And I don't think the king can sit in his palace in Riyadh and think everything in Saudi Arabia is fine. It isn't at all. Actually, there's still this deep nervousness that is taking place across the region. But I also feel that we're in very, very dark days. And I don't think we should we should have any thoughts that this isn't. These are very, very difficult days. but that we have a wider project inside of the Arab world, which I think fits in with the practical solidarity. I think the biggest practical solidarity that we could have done, that we have done inside this country, is that we have a revolutionary party welcoming Syrian revolutionaries to come over, and actually that we are part of a global movement. That's step one. Step two, of course, is people demand the overthrow of the regime as soon as possible. That's also really important. But actually there's a bigger project, which is about rebuilding or building a revolutionary, committed revolutionary organisations across the Arab world. And if people ask me, do we think, however horrible it is at the moment in the Arab world, are we back to square one? I say no. Because we have now practical revolutionary experience from Egypt to Tunisia, from our comrades in Morocco, our comrades now inside of Iraq, that there is actually a clarity that's beginning to appear that hasn't been there for a very, very, very long time. And there is a serious project inside the Arab world to build a real revolutionary current, which Joseph is part of, which Bassem is part of, Egyptian comrades are part of, and so on. I think this is really important. And I just want to end by saying this: the people talk about, and I have to keep coming back to this, that if it was in the interest of the West to intervene in Syria, they would have intervened in Syria. I'll tell you why. And there was a Syrian that told me what was a joke, which I thought was very, very telling. In Iraq, they had oil but no weapons of mass destruction. In Syria, they had weapons of mass destruction but no oil. Which one did they invade? Actually, when Maliki's government in Iraq comes under threat, the questions of arms doesn't even appear. Immediately they send 15,000 Hellfire missiles. Immediately Russia's sending, lending them weapons. Immediately Iran's lending them weapons. So this question really for the Syrians, actually they never wanted it. They never wanted it. If there was one border that was the quietest border with Israel, this was in the border of the Golan Heights. Nothing happened across the Syrian-Israeli border for 30 years. Nothing dare happen. Actually, the truth is they wanted to replace Assad because he was very, very unpopular, but they wanted to keep the regime in place. And they feared quite a lot. They feared absolutely this revolution process that was taking place. Not because if the revolution has succeeded in Syria, we'll be marching on New York tomorrow, but actually because it was seen as part of a wider threat. If it was in their interest, they wouldn't have found the caveats and excuses not to invade. Actually, they've been dragging their feet and caught in their propaganda, if you like, over Syria, but nothing has come of it. There has been nothing that has come to the Syrian revolution. And we come back, I think, to the point that for the success of the revolutions cannot take place in one country, that they have to keep spreading from across border and across border. The heart of the revolutionary process, I say this again, even though I'm Lebanese, I have to admit to it, is in Egypt, and that the Egyptian working class is not yet defeated, that the Tunisian working class is not yet defeated. We're facing hard times, but you can see that point in which it is reignited, in which you'll suddenly see, I think, a shift again inside of Syria. I really hope that is the case. But the immediate and most important task for all Arab revolutionaries is to build revolutionary organisations, because never again are we going to walk into a revolution without an organisation. Because if you have an illusion that simply a movement can do it, just look at Syria. Those most organised, the Islamists, stole it from us. They stole it from us. Why? Because we didn't have anything on the ground. We need revolutionary organisation, and never again shall we make it into a revolution as we had before.